Welcome back to Rock the Metaverse, group screening of some of the best talks from AWE 2021. And here's a fresh new talk by Mike Boland, our favorite XR analyst from Artillery Intelligence and AR Insider. He'll walk us through a more granular set of predictions about the potential market size that will consist of the Metaverse market.
So hi everyone, and thank you. It's great to be here, and I hope to spend the next 10 minutes or so going over some metaverse ecosystem analysis and market sizing. So a quick bit about me for context. I'm a 16-year tech industry analyst, most of that time covering mobile throughout the course of the smartphone era, but for the last 6 years or so, shifting to cover AR and VR exclusively, including founding Artillery Intelligence. So Artillery, for those unfamiliar, is a market research and analyst firm for spatial computing, and that takes form in lots of narrative reports and data deliverables and market forecasts and consumer surveys. We also have a sister publication called AR Insider. So getting right into it, this is what I plan to cover. So starting with some level setting. One thing I'm not going to do is define the metaverse because it's so early and nebulous. There are lots of other definitions you can see here for reference. But that said, there are a few sort of metaverse principles or qualifiers that lead into our analysis today. So for example, there's consensus that the metaverse needs to be embodied or rendered in 3D. It needs to be synchronized in time but place shifted for far-flung participants. And it needs to be interoperable across properties and not owned by any one entity. Now, when you look at those properties, you could argue that we already have a metaverse, and it's called the web. It hits all those marks, with the exception of being embodied. But I bring up the web as a lead-in to our ecosystem discussion because it's the right model, and a sort of metaverse stack could develop just like we have a web stack today. And that's the right model for one of those things I mentioned, which is interoperability. So yes, there are walled gardens like Facebook, but the web is based on standards like the browser and protocols like HTTPS and languages like HTML. And that basic model will, I believe, sort of rule the metaverse. And in that way, it could just be the next iteration of the web rather than something that comes along and replaces it. So that brings us to the meat, which is the ecosystem. And so like any other ecosystem, we quickly start to see these ecosystem maps like this. And this goes back to the metaverse stack that I mentioned. So for example, we'll need hardware to access the metaverse. And that could be some combination of mobile devices and VR headsets. We'll need content and services, which is the equivalent of what we have today in apps and websites. Social graphs could help achieve network effects while also providing a sort of identity layer, and that's what Facebook does today, essentially. Speaking of which, avatar systems will be a key component of the metaverse, and that's an entire presentation in itself. Another key piece will be payment systems and common currency, which is already being developed through crypto, and NFTs. We'll need infrastructure and connectivity, so who will be the Akamai of the metaverse or the Cloudflare of the metaverse? And that could develop some companies, and we're already seeing that happen. Check out a company called Mawari, which is doing some interesting things there in terms of infrastructure. We'll also need standards bodies for registering things like identity, like how we register domains today. So who will be the ICANN of the metaverse? Or perhaps that's the wrong model. Perhaps distributed ledgers will handle authentication and registration of digital assets, including NFTs, obviously, which we're already seeing. And what about creation platforms? What will be the WordPress of the metaverse? We're seeing lots of companies vie for that positioning, like the Robloxes and Decentralands of the world. And the list goes on and on. But those are a few key gaps that are starting to be filled by the companies that you see here. And as a quick side note, it's notable that many of these players will sprout from today's web, while others will be born into this sort of new paradigm with a native advantage, just like we saw happen over the desktop and mobile web. Here's another ecosystem map from CB Insights. So get ready to see lots of these ecosystem maps start to sprout out. And another way to organize this is the tent poles outlined by Matthew Ball. Again, here it's analogous to the tech stack we now have on the web. But the question that emerges from all of this is market sizing. And that's often where our minds go. But We've been a bit torn on market sizing in the metaverse because we have a highly disciplined bottom up forecasting methodology. But there's one downside to that approach, which is that the sector has to actually exist, including reliable inputs and industry leaders and revenue to model out. And the metaverse is so nebulous and early that it sort of evades all of that. So, for example, when you look at all of these pieces that I just went over and go back to that web analogy, the metaverse could someday be the size of the internet or bigger. And that gets into the many trillions of dollars of value changing hands to the point where the number is so large that it's meaningless and not really strategically relevant for anyone except for, link bait headlines with lots of zeros. But to give you some red meat here and not to just sort of cop out on the market sizing, we'll quantify a few aspects of the metaverse that do exist today, especially those within the XR ecosystem. So that's mobile AR, head-worn AR, and VR. And these map to a few of these sort of tent poles again, Matthew Ball's sort of tent poles of the metaverse that you see here. So that brings us to the sort of data dive and closing here with some numbers. So the XR spectrum we track again includes mobile AR, head-worn AR, and VR. So starting with the 40,000 foot view, here they are all together, reaching almost 35 million this year, growing to almost 65 million by 2025. And breaking that down and starting with mobile AR, just one of those three pieces. It's growing from 9.5 billion last year to 26 billion by 2025, and that consists of lots of moving parts across consumer and enterprise, many of them you can see here. So for example, one leading sector today, just to drill down on one of these, is immersive ad placement. So that's growing from about 2 billion last year to 6.7 billion by 2025, and the leading source today is sponsored lens placement in Snapchat and Instagram. And this only includes the sponsored placement and amplification and distribution, not the campaign creation. The latter is where companies like Eighth Wall compete, and that's what you see here. This is where we see mobile AR media and ad creation platforms growing from about 1.1 billion last year to about 4.2 billion by 2025. And there are many other mobile AR subsectors, but that's just a representative sample of a few that are leading the way. So moving on to head-worn AR, we see that growing from about 4.7 billion last year to almost 18 billion in 2025. And like mobile AR, this consists of several subsectors and moving parts. So, for example, the foundation for AR glasses is the hardware base, and that's going to grow from about 500 million units last year, 500,000 units last year, to about 4 million units in 2022. And that's rather steep growth, as you can see here. But keep in mind that the inflections here are due to a couple things. One, Microsoft's massive US Army contract, and Apple's market entrance, which could be announced this year, but probably won't launch until next year. But to also put this into perspective, again, steep growth. But if we look at that 4 million in outer years compared to the smartphone installed base, which is something we all sort of can conceptualize easy, it looks like this. So it's an 879x differential. So it's growing at a fast pace, yes, as you often get with smaller numbers, but it's still miles from ubiquity. So finally, moving on to VR, we see that growing from about 9 billion last year to more than 22 billion in 2025. And that includes a sizable COVID rebound last year, which was also Quest 2's first year in the market. And like the other sectors we looked at, there are many subsectors and revenue sources, with the leading revenue category being hardware. So drilling into that, we see 14 million in hardware unit sales last year across all headsets, growing to about 30 million in 2025. And you can see how that correlates to the installed base here in blue. Now, leading the way here, not surprisingly, is Meta, mostly due to Quest 2, which sold about 5 million units last year and is currently on the cusp of a 10 million unit installed base, which is the magic number, according to Mark Zuckerberg, for a healthy content ecosystem. And we may hear more from Meta soon about that milestone, including a possible announcement in its Q4 earnings coming up on February 2nd. So we'll be watching closely for that. So that's it for me. That was a lot of numbers in a short period, but we're available for questions. And I'll also reiterate one thing, that those three XR subsectors that we just sort of dove into from a quantitative perspective are just one corner of the metaverse, and it'll grow in lots of directions that haven't even been defined yet. It's like conceptualizing the iPhone in 2005, and no one at that point really envisioned, Snapchat or Uber or Tinder and other smartphone native innovations. So similarly, the real metaverse use cases and innovation and definition and that ecosystem as it starts to take form will come from the native players who emerge in the coming years and even decades to sort of define it. So I'll put a period there. I hope this has been valuable, and thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching Rock the Metaverse event streamed on Alive. To watch the next session, click join on the next talk on the agenda and enjoy. And if you missed any previous session, it's always available here to watch on demand.